The question is not only of ignorance, but also of certain kind of perceptions about the whole region and about Iran in particular. How is that perception molded over a period of time? I did as many of you are, I was an MPhil student here in the early 80s, immediately after the Iranian Revolution, and did my MPhil dissertation on the documents that were captured from the American embassy in Iran, which was released by students at that point of time who captured the embassy. You know the famous or the notorious hostage crisis during 1979 and 81. I went through several volumes of documents. That was the kind of WikiLeaks of that time, to actually see confidential American files and what they were actually conveying between themselves, between the State Department and the American Embassy in Iran, between different news gathering provisions within Iran, in Tabriz, in Isfahan, obviously various parts of Iran and so on. And what was interesting, when I was reading all these things, during the revolutionary moment in Iran, the Americans did not get any sense of the idea that there is a revolutionary movement happening in Iran. It does not come out of just ignorance of Iran, but it also, ignorance is part of that. There's, V.G. Kernan, the famous historian, has mentioned it's only in the darkness of our ignorance that everything looks, everything takes the same hue, according to him. Everything looks the same. So a monolithic perception about Iran was slowly built up, along with this lack of understanding of what's happening. My own research at that point of time showed me that this was mainly because the Americans not understanding that there is a revolutionary movement happening in Iran, basically because it was not happening, the revolution was not happening according to the conventional understanding of modern revolutions, starting from the French Revolution onwards. And therefore, the very idea that Islam can be a contemporary ideology, it can function as a revolutionary ideology in the case of Iran, that was never understood, because that was not what they were inquiring into. They were talking to elites in the cities, to university professors, to ex-ambassadors and people like that, on an informal basis and collecting information, who are also far removed from what's happening in the countryside, in smaller towns, even in the shanty towns of Tehran, where major revolutionary movement was built up. The point is that there has been a history of American perceptions of Iran that was built both on ignorance at one level and a lack of understanding, not coming only out of ignorance, but a perspective which is based on some tools and methodologies which cannot capture the minds of what's happening in societies like ours, like Iran, like many other places, which is a kind of continuation of what Said called the hegemonic colonial discourse, like Orientalism. That kind of hegemonic understanding of the region, and Iran as a country in particular, is at the background of today's perceptions about Iran. When President Bush in 2002 called Iran as part of the axis of evil, axis of evil is not a political term at all. It's a religious term. It's a kind of, and evil has to be destroyed by any means, isn't it? It cannot be allowed to grow. So that destroying the Iranian evil has been part and parcel of the American political establishment, the foreign policy establishment, and to a large extent the academic establishment as well, because academic Orientalism and Middle Eastern studies in the United States contributed a lot to these kinds of perceptions about the region. So we are not out of that spectrum of the linkage between power and knowledge in this case. The Iranians historically, until 1953, did not have much, hatred towards Iran, towards the United States. No. Rather, it was the other way around. The American model of democracy at that point of time, the American people who came to Iran for significant purposes, many of them were darlings of the Iranians. For example, Howard Baskerville, in the early part of the 20th century, when the constitutional revolution was happening in Iran, people demanding the Shah at that time, a constitution, a representative government. And Howard Baskerville, who was teaching in Tabriz, supported the movement, and he had to give his life for that kind of support. So there were Americans in Iran who were dear to people's movements, etc. Even an official like Simon Schuster, who was again an advisor, economic advisor during the Constitutional Revolution, supported the revolution, not involving in it like Baskerville and others. Then what changed historically between Iran and the United States? Iranian perceptions about the United States. It was 1953. That is when Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh's government, which Iran by then had the constitution and an elected parliament, the Majlis. Even though the Shah was there on top of the political system, but the Majlis had some powers. The parliament had powers. And Prime Minister was Dr. Mossadegh of the National Front at that time, consisting of liberals and others, who in 1951, when he became Prime Minister, nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. That was the beginning of it. Because from 1906, when oil was commercially found, and they understood that it can be exploited, from then onwards, until the 1950s, it was British companies, American companies were coming in, but mostly British-controlled petroleum industry. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was the central element within that. So Dr. Mossadegh's nationalistic kind of policy at that time, you should remember that there is some kind of in post-colonial, what is called at that point of time as the third world was slowly emerging. I'm talking about the early 50s. And by 55, you have the Bandung Conference. By early 60s, you have the non-aligned movement and so on. So that was the time when anti-imperialism was a cherished value in politics for countries of Asia and Africa, which is very, very significant. And Mossadegh was informed by and actually a pioneer of these kinds of neutralist tendencies in world politics at that point of time. So his nationalization of Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 51 obviously was his end as well. See, who are you to challenge our hegemony? In 1953, the CIA conducted a coup in Iran. It's called Operation Ajax, AJAX, led by Kermit Roosevelt, who was the director of that program. Both British and, this was not against the Americans. The nationalization was Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. It was against the British company. But Britain and the United States coming together and hatching a coup, a secret plan. And now, you have all the documents of the 1953 coup available. But those who were working in the region, there's nothing new that we could find. Much of it was already known, but the details are there for everybody to see now. And this is one operation the CIA never denied. You see, you should also, now because the documents are there, there was no question of denial also. Earlier when they were accused of it, they kept mum on that. So that is an elected government of Mossadegh, and not only a prime ministership under the Shah of that kind. What happened in 51 when the nationalization, etc. happened? The Shah had to leave Iran. So it was a big threat to monarchy because the monarch was supporting up British and American interests in Iran. So he had to go out of the country during that. He was very young at that point of time, thought to be very powerless before an elected parliament. And what Mossadegh did was to assert the power of the people, the elected portion of the government, against the monarch's singular kind of control over the political system. So when he was overthrown through the CIA coup, Operation Ajax, that's a funny kind of coup. There was a big demonstration in Iran. People were paid to participate in that. So all kinds of ruffians, all kinds of goons and others from Tehran were mobilized by paying money. And the Shah was brought in a plane and was reinstated on the peacock throne again by the Americans. And that was the beginning, 1953, was the beginning of the Shah-American relationship, Iran-American relationship at the governmental level, which was very intimate because the Shah was afraid of his own security and power, and the Americans found this opportunity, and because British imperialism was on the wane, everywhere it was almost ending, and therefore it was the American opportunity, and the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the Americans was slowly coming up by the 50s. So the Americans found Iran as a very significant country, and its Shah, as one of its later, in the 70s, the Shah was called the policeman of American policy in the Gulf region. So that policeman role was given to him. So he was satisfied with that, more or less. So that kind of a linkage between the United States and Iran was coming from 53 onwards, and it lasted until 1979, the Iranian Revolution. The Iranian Revolution and what you see in contemporary contestation and the whole dangerous game that we are now talking about, the whole issue in the Gulf now, the starting point is the Iranian Revolution of 78-79. The revolution was both anti-monarchist and anti-imperialist. These were two ideological positions of the revolution. And the Iranian Revolution, where people from all walks of Iranian life participated. It was truly a popular movement. Don't confuse between the nature of the regime that came after the revolution and the actual revolutionary movement which overthrew the Shah. There are other political factors at work when the Shah was removed. But until his removal, it was literally a very significant 20th century revolution where people of Iran were successful. They were successful in ousting both their monarchy. And that monarchy, you should remember, as a system, was there almost for 2,500 years. In different names, This was the Pahlavi thing. Before that, the Qajas. Before that, the Safavi, and the Sassanians, and so on and so forth, going back to thousands of years. So it is such an important political development for Iranian history. For the world, not only the removal of the Shah, but the kind of resistance that revolution put forward against American imperialism is very significant. That was the time when the Soviet Union was already, it's still there. And Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the most significant leader of the revolution, even though he was not in Iran from 1960s onwards. He was in Iraq and in Turkey, and finally when the revolutionary movement was happening, he was in France. So he came back to Iran after the 60s, only after the revolution. But his name was very significant. So Khomeini and others were talking about the United States as great Satan. So if you have the axis of evil thing later, there's already a way of describing the United States from the Iranian side. The Soviet Union was the lesser Satan. Satan, obviously, but not that dangerous as the Americans. So the great Satan was the image that the Americans had got. What a change from the first half of the 20th century to the later decades of the 20th century, in the very perception of the Iranians over the American interests in the region and perception about America in general. And this upset, the Iranian Revolution upset the whole thing. The Americans lost it completely. So if in March 25th, 1979, if the Shah left Iran, then there was a provisional government under engineer Mehdi Bazargan, who is again a liberal. And in November 1979, you have students who call themselves as the followers of the line of Imam, that's Khomeini, capturing the American embassy. And that's termed as going against all international law and convention. But Khomeini did not care, because he got information that the new powers that be in Iran, even though that's a provisional kind of arrangement, the new constitution is yet to come into force. It was already in the process of drafting. And the Americans were still trying to, after losing Iran, still trying to have some kind of influence in Iran. The documents that Khomeini saw much before the capture of the embassy could be found in the document that I mentioned. I've analyzed it. So Khomeini somehow had people who can get him American secret documents, etc. That's why he sent the students to capture the embassy. And that hostage crisis, as you know, continued. You have films about it, even though take them with a spoonful of salt, actually, and so on, Argo and other things that you could see. From then onwards, there's no diplomatic relations between the United States and Iran. I spent the last semester, most part of it, in Tehran, taught there. So when all these new developments were happening, I was there in Iran. So how the sanctions regime was affecting them, how people are responding to situations, different sections of society, how are they perceiving the United States now, and many other things. 78, 79, anti-imperialist ideology, which was never abandoned by Iran by any means. It is not very easy to give a kind of blanket check for Iranian administrations, whether it's the president or the foreign minister, to do such negotiations with who was earlier called the Great Satan, even though now the Iranians won't use that term much to describe the Americans. Even the current president of the United States is not called by that name, even though it would have been better if it's used now, but they have done it earlier. So this confrontation between the conservative and the liberals thought that they had a victory because the JCPO was signed. The Europeans and the Americans agreed to ease sanctions, so there will be more investment coming, the banking sector will be open, there will be more jobs created, business can come up, and so on. But you have Trump coming to power, and last year withdrawing from the JCPOA. And it is this development, again, which was a big blow to the liberals, that Khomeini and others, the conservatives said, we told you so. Why to waste your energy on these kinds of people? And give a bad name to Iran, diluting its ideology, etc. And so now you see the conservative bloc gets more strengthened because of not any of Iranian actions, but of the American action. So this is very important, how reactions come from Iran on the current sanctions and also the military build-up in the Gulf. The IRGC, which is now, is it last month or so? Yes, that Trump declared it as a terrorist organization. First time the Americans declaring from the region a government military apparatus as a terrorist organization is the Republican Guards of Iran, who is actually controlling the Gulf region, who is giving instructions to either attack. You know that drone from the American side was shot at by the IRGC. So you could see that is now termed as a terrorist entity. And Americans were talking about Iran as, when the foreign secretary came here to Delhi a few weeks back, isn't it? He told us that Iran is the biggest sponsor of terrorism in the world. That logic has been functioning for quite some time because of the Iranian influence in Iraq, in Syria, among the Hezbollahs in Lebanon, among the Houthis in Yemen, and so on and so forth. So all that is termed as a support to terrorist organizations. And therefore, that kind of logic was being built up now. And its own military wing, part of the Iranian military wing, the Republican Guards, were termed as terrorist organization by the Trump administration. Now, the Iranian ideological and even material assistance, particularly to the Shia world within the West Asian region, is seen as a big threat by Saudi Arabia. And Saudi-Iran rivalry within the Gulf region, if you go and say Gulf, the Iranians will be very angry. You should call it Persian Gulf, that's the official name. They would say, for our own advantage with the Arabian part of the Gulf and the Iranians, we just somehow call it only the Gulf. So in the Gulf, Iran and Saudi Arabia had big rivalry over regional control and regional power status in that sense. It has been an ongoing thing. But with the Iranian Revolution, the Saudis understood that, and the Ayatollah Khomeini not only termed the Americans as the greatest enemy, the great Satan, but because Saudi Arabia was a stooge of American policy in the region, and Saudi Arabia is a monarchy, both elements of Iranian revolutionary ideology, anti-monarchism and anti-imperialism, makes Saudi Arabia a natural kind of, if not a total enemy, because Saudi Arabia cannot be a complete enemy, because Mecca and Medina are situated there. Iranians go for Hajj and things of that sort. Even though the majority of the Iranians and a vast majority within the eastern province of Saudi Arabia are Shias, even though generally the large majority of Saudi population is Sunni, but there are pockets where the Shias are dominant. So Ayatollah Khomeini not only was giving anti-imperialism and anti-monarchism, but was initially promoting a policy that's called export of the revolution.
export of the revolution means anti-monarchism. So the Saudis were really scared. Given the mammoth revolution that Iran has undertaken, the Shah was removed. The Shah, supported by the most important, most powerful superpower of that time, the Americans. Both of them were in a way defeated through the revolution. If that is the case, Iran can also have total detrimental effect on the Saudi political system, which is monarchic in character. So that fear, that is the context in which the GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council, etc., was emerging in the early 80s. People think that it's an economic or any other thing. It's in shambles now because of Saudi-Qatar problems, etc. But at that point of time, it emerged as keeping in view of the security threats that Saudi Arabia and the smaller Gulf monarchies felt after the Iranian Revolution. So the Saudi system and other smaller monarchies in the Gulf always depended upon American presence within the region. You have in Bahrain their presence, you have in Saudi soil American presence, you have fleets of very sophisticated kind in the Gulf region, and all in the name of protecting the most important resource, oil, in the Gulf. But there is also the political purpose of serving these monarchies and protecting their interests in the Gulf region. And America was providing that. So Saudi-American relations, even though there were some problems after 9/11 in that relationship, etc., but in general, it continued. From the very beginning, the Saudis were very close to the British, and the Saudis were very close to the Americans after it became a global power. So many people think that all Islamic elements and countries are against the Americans. In the region, most of these Islamic regimes, except in the case of Iran, were pro-Western, because they came up and literally fought. The Saudis fought wars in Yemen against the secular elements. Nobody remembers now the Yemeni case. In 1990, it was unified. There was South Yemen and North Yemen. South Yemen was a Marxist government. And people forget those kinds of histories, which is not a distant history or anything of that sort, which was supported by the radical Arab nationalists like Nasser and others. So the confrontation at that point of time, 50s and 60s, was mainly between radical Arab nationalism and Saudi-like Islamic regimes. And the Islamic regimes were mostly pro-Western in character in the region. It is against this kind of common logic that the Iranian Revolution and the Islamic Republic of Iran came up, which upset that kind of an equation totally. So Iran-Saudi rivalry within the region has all these intricacies within that. Particularly Saudi fear of Iran instigating the Shias of eastern Saudi Arabia, Iranian influence among the Houthis in Yemen, and Saudi's own involvement in Yemen, military involvement. It's actually military intervention and war that Saudi Arabia is conducting in Yemen, and the catastrophic nature of it. Nobody cares now how many children are dying, how many people are dying on an everyday scale in Yemen. So this is one side of the confrontation, Saudi-Iran. The other side, the major factor, is Israel. For whom is the bell tolling? What is this confrontation all about? Why is Trump taking this kind of position? It's mainly to protect Israeli interests in the region. Because Israel finds that Saudi Arabia is pliable. It has always been. The Americans were there in between them, even though they themselves did not have much closer ties. But now there are channels open, there are negotiations between the Saudis and the Israelis, but still the Israelis never find the Arab threat in general a big problem, both militarily and politically. Earlier it was a problem when Arab nationalism was strong. Nasser, Egypt on the other side, which was very powerful at that point of time, and Syria under the Ba'athist regime, Father Bashar, was supposed to be a big threat because there was Arab-Israeli wars of different kinds between these players. But not Saudi Arabia, even during that time. Because from the 70s onwards, in the 70s, under Nixon, for example, Nixon's, Guam doctrine, in the region it was called the twin pillar policy of the Nixon administration. The two pillars of American interest in the Gulf was one Saudi Arabia, the other Iran. And because Iran and Saudi Arabia both did not have that kind of close linkage, even though Shah's Iran had some relationship with Israel, but they were treated as separate. Now the Israeli factor is mingled with all these things. So that's the third major element after Iran and Saudi Arabia. Very important, a nuclear power, and Israel does not want another nuclear power in the region, which they term as an existential threat to them. Their nuclear arsenals are not an existential threat to anybody else. That's the assumption. So why is Iran, after all, developing nuclear capability, etc.? It says that it's for peaceful purposes, etc. Need not necessarily be. These are part and parcel of this rivalry that you see within the region. And therefore, Netanyahu, you know, I don't know whether you remember his speech in the UN with that bomb that can explode at any time, the Iranian bomb. So heavy propaganda, and now Netanyahu has greater influence in Washington with Trump's own family members, with Trump's own administration in general. And you know how Jerusalem, the American embassy was shifting to Jerusalem, how occupied Golan Heights was regarded as part of Israeli legal kind of things, in both cases. But such things were developing. So protecting Israeli interests within the region is a major element that actually compelled Trump to withdraw from the JCPOA and go for much more confrontationist attitude towards Iran. And both Israel and the Americans think that greater sanctions, very stiff sanctions on Iran will make it budge to actually leave the nuclear field altogether. That's the aim. Whether that will be successful or not is something that has to be seen. So what you see now, the drone attacks and few shooting here and there on vessels, capturing of vessels, etc., as part and parcel of this kind of a situation. I'll stop there and I'll be happy to take up some important questions that you may have or would like to hear from you if you have different opinions about the whole thing. Thank you very much.